Alright, so I haven't done a video in a while. These videos, formerly known as Knife Talk, are now Knife Thoughts to go along with my new website and blog, knifethoughts.com, and on Instagram and Twitter at Knife Thoughts. I've been busy with working on this and all kinds of other stuff, so I just haven't had time to make a video. But this one I think is going to be an interesting one. A lot of you who are watching this might already know some of this information that I'm going to give about blade shapes, but it'll be cool seeing the different expressions or styles of the different blade shapes that I have. And like I say, it's going to go with a Knife Thoughts article, so kind of a visual add-on to the article. And don't forget to check out that knifethoughts.com. It'll take you right to the blog, but there's also links to this YouTube channel and everything, so you can check that out. And one thing I wanted to do is I want to give away one of these stickers to whoever comments below the basically the best idea or the most unique idea or the idea I like best for a future Knife Thoughts article. I've got a lot of ideas already, but and probably too many to keep up with. There's all kinds of different things I'd like to write about, but I'm always looking for feedback. So if you guys have any ideas that pop right into your head, let me know, or you can take a look at the blog, see what I've written about already, and let me know what you'd like to read more about. And just general feedback also. But if you comment an idea for a Knife Thoughts article in the comments here on this video, I'll pick the one I like the best. Sorry, I know I have some people who watch from out of the US, and I really appreciate that. Give another shout out to Patty's Potato Peelers. He's got a really cool channel and often watches and comments on my videos. But for this, if you're in the US, I'll be able to send it to you. Otherwise, I'm not exactly sure about how shipping envelopes to other countries works. But anyway, comment below your ideas, and let's get into the meat of the video here. So this video, like I said, is going to be on blade shapes. Wow, the color here changed quite a bit. And there's a lot of different blade shapes, and they're really variable. They can go on, kind of a continuum rather than this is this definitely and this is that. But there are some ways to define different blade shapes. So I'm going to start out with a really traditional spear point. So the spear point blade shape is one that you see a lot, and a really good example of it that I have is this Gradation Cutlery Titty-Ute number 78. So this is the American Jack, and it's a really traditional spear point. So let's talk about what a spear point is. A spear point has a spine and edge that both curve towards the point, and generally will have a really similar curvature towards the point. Now, like I say, that changes, and I'll show you some differences in that. Some knives that don't curve the same amount on each side, but GEC makes some that are literally the same curve. Another thing here is that the curve is further towards the tip than towards the handle, or the ricasso, or whatever you want to call this area. That makes it a little different than something like a leaf-shaped blade, which I'll talk about in a second. But this is a really traditional spear point. But we can also have a spear point that is more like this. So this is a Gradation Cutlery Titty-Ute number 18 Beagle. And you see, again, the curve is pretty similar here, going towards the point at the tip side of the blade rather than the handle. But it's a lot straighter, and it's also thinner. There's less of an outward angle to the edges in comparison of these two. So this is still a spear point blade shape, although if this were a secondary blade, you would usually call it a pen shape blade. So I'll show you some pen blades also. But a more full main blade sized example of a spear point blade shape that is really slender and not a tall blade and pretty even and parallel with the edges is this. This is a Gradation Cutlery Northfield number 65 Ben Hogan. And you can see it's more similar in shape to this than it is to this. But it's still a spear point. From there, we can get into a little bit less of the parallel spine, but still really slender. So you can see that there's some differences here. The spine isn't as parallel with the edge on this. It does get, you know, a little bit wider and everything, but it's still pointy, and it's actually a little bit more pointy than this one. And you can compare it to this, and it's definitely different. The curve of the spine and the edge are still pretty similar, but they're a little bit less pronounced than on this Great Eastern Cutlery. And this is a Jeffrey Mitchell. You can see his tang stamp there, custom. Check him out, he does good work. I'll have an article and a video on custom knives. This is my only, no, that's not true. This is my only custom folding knife right now. But good example of the fact that a spear point can be pretty pointy and a little bit more elongated on that curve. So this is another spear point. And then going in kind of the other direction here, we can go all the way up to, for example, something like a Great Eastern Cutlery, or really any large toenail or Coke bottle pattern like this. So this is still a spear point. You can see it's not parallel, the edge and the spine. It is, you know, outward angled so that it gets pretty bulbous here, but the spine and the edge both curve relatively similarly towards the point. And another thing about spear points, and this is kind of has some variation, but the point is usually close to the center of the handle. But again, that varies. So this is a pretty extreme example of a spear point, but an even more extreme example is an elephant toenail, or a, they call this the whaler. It's a Great Eastern Cutlery, Tidiute actually, whaler. And you can see that, again, pretty equal curve on the spine and edge, point in the middle, but super, super wide. So really far end of the spectrum when compared to, again, something like this. But both spear point blade shapes. So you can see that there's a lot of variation in the spear point, and that's true also for modern knives. So I'm gonna bring some modern knives into this equation. And a good example of a spear point on a modern knife is the Ray Laconico designed, mass drop produced, WE knife manufactured Keen. You can see that the curve of the edge and the spine are pretty similar. Now, I did have some people, I asked on Instagram, and some people said they thought that this was more of a drop point. I agree that it's moving towards a drop point because the spine is less of a curve than the edge, but it's considered a spear point by Ray Laconico, or mass drop, that's what they have it listed as. And I think that traditionally, if you saw this knife on, you know, a traditional handle like this, you would think of it as a spear point. So this is one example of a modern spear point. You can see it has, you know, a lot of those same characteristics. But then we can move into something that's a little bit less traditional, like the steel wheel gecko. This has a swedge, which, you know, doesn't make it not traditional, but definitely moving towards a drop point, which is going to be the next blade shape I talk about. Significantly more curve to this edge than there is to this edge, and I actually didn't check to see what steel wheel considers this blade to be. It very well could be a drop point. It's one of those things where it's kind of in between, and that's like the continuum that I talked about. It's hard to say sometimes, you know, which a knife is. This is definitely between a spear point and a drop point. And to talk about another knife is the Spyderco Native 5. Now the previous natives, the Native FRN and the Native 4, were definitely spear points. The point was a little bit closer to the center, and it had more of a pronounced curve at the top. This is, I think Spyderco considers this a leaf-shaped blade, but it's really not quite a leaf-shaped blade because this edge is pretty straight here. So a leaf-shaped blade is a traditional blade shape. A lot of, like the barong, which is a traditional fixed blade, and some of even older, like stone knives, had leaf-shaped blades. And what that means is both the spine and the edge are continuously curved towards the point. So there wouldn't be this straight edge here. But, very similar to a spear point, and, easily confused, especially when that continuous curve is not very pronounced, like on this knife. But that's just another example of something that I would probably consider a spear point on a modern knife. Now, moving on to another kind of variation of the spear point, we have the dagger grind spear point. So this is the Kershaw Decimus designed by Hinder Knives, and this is, as you can see, it's the same shape as a spear point, right? It has a curve, a similar, or actually on this, an exact same curve of both the edge and the spine going towards the tip, and the tip is in the center in relation to the handle. But the difference here is the fact that it's ground on both sides. It's a saber grind, so it's not a full flat grind, saber grind from this center line, and there's a false edge, although sometimes it is a real edge. So this is a dagger grind. And another example, very often you see a dagger grind on traditional Italian switchblades. So this is a swing guard Italian switchblade, and from Frank B in Italy, and it has that same saber or dagger grind. And then another good example of that, showing that often this kind of grind can be a double-edged knife, is the, got a lot of knives to get out here, is the Cold Steel FGX Balisong. So this is an all-plastic knife. It's a fiberglass reinforced plastic, but you can see that it has that same grind. This one isn't all the way to the center line, as you can see, but it's ground on both sides, equal curvature, and an edge on both sides. So another kind of subcategory of spear point blades, and you can see that there's a lot of variation. So let's move on to the drop point blade shape. So like I said here, the steel wheel gecko is moving towards that because a drop point, rather than having an equal curve of the spine and the edge, is going to have significantly more curve of the edge towards the point than the spine. So this is a Gradation Cutlery, just Gradation Cutlery 74. It's a rendezvous knife. I think it might have a little bit of blade wrap. But this is definitely a drop point. So you can see there's significantly more curve of the edge towards the point than on the spine, but there is some curve on the spine. Now, there doesn't necessarily always have to be. There's kind of a subcategory of the drop point called the straight edge, or and then there's other blade shapes that I'm not going to cover that would have this type of edge here. But generally a slight drop of the spine towards the point, but you notice that the point is not so much in the center in relation to the handle as on the spear points. And another example of this is a lot of traditional sodbuster patterns. Sometimes they call them butcher blades, but really they're drop points. You can see that there is a curve downward towards the tip of the spine, but the edge is significantly more curved upwards. Very traditional drop point blade shape, and like I say, sometimes they're called different things. I think that's more branding than it is, to define it, but the sodbuster pattern often has drop points. Now, usually a drop point is a main blade shape, but sometimes it can be a secondary, like on some jackknives that, traditional patterns, as well as some whittlers. And then also, some of you probably got some of these on the recent run. Great Eastern Cutlery puts a drop point as a secondary blade rather than a spay blade on their 82 Dixie Stockman. So this is another example of a drop point. Again, you see that pronounced curve to upwards of the edge towards the tip, a slight curve downwards towards the tip, and the tip is closer to the spine than it is to the kick or the edge. So that's the drop point. And one thing, the drop point blade shape is very often seen in modern knives. So for example, a really well-known probably modern knife drop point is a lot of the Hinderer designs. So again, this is a Hinderer design from Zero Tolerance, the ZTO 561, and very classic drop point. So you can see some straight edge, then a curve upwards towards the tip, and a slight curve. So a lot of modern knives have a drop point, and I think that part of that is because modern knives with one-hand opening and locking are kind of an answer to carrying fixed blades. So I'll show you a couple more modern one-hand opening drop point knives. Sorry about that. This is a real cheap Geralt knife, but I'm sure there's lots of other knives similarly shaped, although this isn't a clone actually. I looked around, it doesn't seem like it's cloned off of anything. Not that this is a discussion about that, but I thought it was amazing that I could get this knife for $6 and it's not a knockoff of anything. And this lock type is not patented anymore. So again, a very classic drop point blade shape. And then another example here of a slightly modified drop point blade shape is this. I think they actually call this a modified sheep foot, but it's kind of ridiculous. There's some straight edge here, and then it curves up towards the tip. This has more of a pronounced downward curve of the spine, and so maybe that's why they call it a modified sheep foot. But this is the Kershaw Thistle. Nice knife, it's discontinued, but another example of the fact that these blade shapes are pretty fungible. They can be altered and still kind of exist somewhere between two different styles. But like I said, a lot of fixed blades are drop points, especially like Western style camp knives. So you can see this is the Steel Wheel Roamer R300. Really, really nice knife. D2, pretty inexpensive, been on sale a lot recently. But very classic drop point. Straight spine, straight edge, then a slight drop of the spine, and a really pronounced curve of the edge. So that's a very traditional outdoors camp knife, fixed blade. And then another example of that is this knife, which is a Blind Horse Knives, now split into Battle Horse Knives and LT Wright Knives, Woodsman Pro, and you can see slight curve, pronounced curve. Really works well as an outdoors knife, and I think that that's why a lot of modern one-hand opening knives have a drop point, is because they kind of took the place of a fixed blade, because it's just more convenient to carry a knife that folds than a fixed blade. But there's a big difference in what you can do with a fixed blade and a slip joint, but there's a little bit less big of a difference of what you can do with a fixed blade and a one-hand opening locking knife. So anyway, let's move on. So that's the drop point blade shape. So we'll move on to the clip point blade shape. A clip point blade shape is another one that's pretty variable. I'm going to show a good number of different clip point blade shapes here because they are so varied. And I have a lot of clip point blade shape knives just because it's a blade shape that's used pretty often. But we'll start out here talking about the classic clip point. So this is kind of an interesting example actually. Usually a clip point is a main blade. Sometimes it's a secondary, like on this knife that I showed earlier. But a clip point is a knife that has usually a slightly upward curved spine and a straight or slightly downward curved edge at the beginning. Then it has the edge curves upwards towards the tip, and there's a clipped portion. So it just is, you can imagine clipping part of a spear point off, basically. That's where that name comes from. A clip point is, you know, if you clipped part of the blade off. And usually it's, you know, if you added the blade back on, it would be similar to a spear point. Like I say, not a super pronounced curve, although sometimes it is, because that's something that can change with a clip point, is how pronounced this curve of the edge is and how long and how concave the clip is. So this is a relatively concave clip. It can be even more. It can turn the edge, the tip upward, and that can be called a scimitar blade or a Turkish clip point. But more of an upward turn tip is possible on a clip point, but less so on a classic clip point. So again, straight edge, curve towards the tip, and a clipped portion that's usually concave or close to it. So this is a classic clip point. Like I say, usually it's a main blade, like on this example, which is the Gradation Cutlery Northfield number 98 Texas Camp Knife. And you can see again, upward curve of the spine, downward curve of the edge, slight, not super pronounced curve of the edge up towards the tip, and a clipped portion of the blade, a little bit longer on this one, and a little bit less concave. So this is another classic clip point. And there are a lot of other kinds of classic clip points. Both of those had a swedge, but they don't have to have a swedge. So actually, let me show you one more example of a swedge, because this is a little bit straighter of a spine and a little bit straighter of the initial edge. So less upward curved of the spine and downward curved of the edge, but a similar clip here. So this is a Gradation Cutlery number 35. So another example of a classic clip point. But the clip point, the classic clip point, can also not have that swedge. Like this example, this is a Queen number 41 Copperhead. And you can see very straight edge here, a little bit more abrupt of a curve of the edge, and a little bit more straight of a clip. So you can see it's less concave, but it's similarly lengthed and you know, pretty similar in overall shape, let alone that less concave curve of the clip and more abrupt curve there. So this is another example of a kind of a classic clip point. And let's see, another classic clip point is like this one. You can see it's a really straight spine, really straight edge, and a lot less of an abrupt curve towards the tip of the edge, and a lot more of a clipped spine. So that's another example of that. And then we can move into the slender clip point. So there's a lot of different slender clip points also. This is what you would call a Turkish clip point. So you can see that the spine here curves upward slightly, but then it's a really long clip. So you can see the clip goes almost the whole length of the blade there. And there is straight spine and then a really gentle curve up towards the tip. So this is more of a Turkish clip point, and it's an example of a slender clip point. And this is a Gradation Cutlery number 38 special from the 2017 Rendezvous. But another example of a slender clip point is the slimline trapper. So this is a Queen version of it that they call the utility trapper, but Case also makes one. You can see that it's really slender and pretty slight upward curve here, but a long clip and a really gentle curve towards the tip. So another version of the slender clip point. And one more, actually, two more. Oops. So this is a Grayish Cutlery number 53 Stockman, and this is less slender, but it's still a slender clip point because this clip is so long. So you can see how long and gradual this clipped area is, but it still is a clip point because there is a direct change from this clipped area to here. It's not just curved downward. And then a little bit more abrupt of a curve upward towards the tip on the edge on this one, but it's still, I would consider it a slender clip point. And then there's one more kind of clip point. The last kind of clip point here is a saber ground clip point. So this is another traditional type of clip point, and it usually has a swedge and is saber ground. So rather than being ground the whole way up like pretty much all of those knives were, it's only ground part of the way, and it makes it a little bit thicker of a knife, a little bit sturdier, and it gives it a different look. And I include this even though it's just a different blade grind, because it is traditional. A lot of older trappers, like this Great Egyptian Cutlery Rendezvous Special number 74 Improved Trapper, and a lot of hunters, this Queen Hunter, had a saber ground clip point, as well as Great Egyptian Cutlery's new 97 pattern, which is a very traditional Coke bottle, which large Coke bottles often have this saber ground clip point. I'll be doing a video and an article on the only one of those knives that I'm getting, which is the Allegheny Mountain Knife Collectors Association version, which I'm getting today, so that's exciting. But I'll do a version of that, and that's another saber ground clip point. So that's the clip point. It's a knife that I have a lot of because I really like it. I think it's a useful blade shape, and I think it's a very traditional looking blade shape. And it's one that a lot of people know of because it's the blade shape that is the Bowie or Bowie knife, although I'm always going to say Bowie. And, you know, people seen it in movies like Crocodile Dundee, Rambo, you know, all those people carried Bowies, which is just a version of the clip point. So it's a pretty well-known knife design. I don't have any modern clip points, although there is one that I have that is somewhat close, which is the Spyderco Endura. Every now and then I think about considering this a clip point. I actually also have a Spyderco Chalkway, which is even closer to being a modern version of a clip point, but it's not quite a clip point. Definitely, you know, a modified clip point. But they do make some modern clip points, like the Benchmade Crooked River and things like that. Boker makes some. So you can get a modern knife with a clip point, but so that's most of the straight edges, I believe, straight edge blade patterns, blade shapes. So we'll move into the, the curved edge. We'll move into the straight edge blade shapes. So I want to show all three of these at the same time, or at least two of them, and the closest thing that I have to the third. So the three straight edge pattern blade shapes I'm going to talk about are the Wharncliffe, the Sheepfoot, and the Coping blade. So real quick before I talk about that, one other blade shape I don't have many of, but is kind of a modified clip point, is the Spey blade. It's a very traditional blade shape. You can see it has just a super short clipped space of the edge, or the spine right there. So that's why I consider it, you know, similar to a clip point. If you extended that clip quite a bit, it would look like a clip point. But it's a traditional blade shape. It's a Spey blade. I just don't have many of these, but a Spey blade has usually parallel spine and edge, and then an extremely abrupt curve upwards towards the tip of the edge, and a very short clip section right at the tip there. So that's another pattern, or blade shape that I didn't really talk about. But talk about the Wharncliffe, the Sheepfoot, and the Coping blade. Now, before I talk about this, this is not a Coping blade. It is a small Sheepfoot, but we're going to imagine for today that it's a Coping blade, and I'll tell you what the difference is. But all of these blade shapes have straight edges. So you can see straight edges from the tip to the spine, or I'm sorry, from the handle to the tip. And the difference really is in the curvature of the spine to the tip. So you can see on this is a Wharncliffe. It's parallel, but pretty quickly moving from the handle, it has a gradual curve towards the tip. So rather than being an abrupt curve or with a straight edge or a cut off, like a clipped portion, it is really curved and gradually curved. So that's what a Wharncliffe is. Moving on to a sheepfoot now, and this is a pretty abrupt sheepfoot. The edge and the spine are generally parallel. Sometimes, this was a discussion on blade forums recently, sometimes it's not, sometimes they go away from each other, but generally parallel. And then the clipped portion, or the downward curved portion towards the edge, is farther from the handle, and it is slightly curved. So you can see there's a slight curve there. It's not just clipped off and there's an angle. There is a curve, but then it's a straight edge from the curve to the tip. So that's a sheepfoot. Now, a coping blade, the spine and edge are parallel, and then there's a straight clipped portion so that there's just an angle. Now this is a very small sheepfoot, but it is curved, so this is a sheepfoot. But if you imagine this knife without this curved portion, so just a straight edge, a straight spine here, and then another straight spine here, kind of like the back, kind of like if you're familiar with a Tonto blade shape, which I'll show next, kind of like that, but on a Tonto, this portion would be sharpened, and the edge on a coping blade would be unsharpened. So it's like the opposite of a Tonto blade shape. But that's the coping blade. And this is a blade shape that recently, in the last few years, has become, these straight edge blade shapes have become more popular with modern knife makers. They've been modifying them a lot. So I'll show again. This, considered a modified sheepfoot by Kershaw, I guess. So a little bit far from a sheepfoot for me to consider it that. But a good example of a modern knife modified is the Spyderco Rhodey. So you can see almost a straight edge, and there's a little bit more of a curve there than on a traditional sheepfoot, but pretty close. So, this is like a modified sheepfoot. And then another example would be the Kershaw Cinder, another Hinderer design. So you can see pretty close to a straight edge, pretty similar shape here, but the angle of the blade is just a little different. So a couple examples of a modern knife company making us a blade that's similar to a straight edge knife like the Wharncliffe, and I'll show a couple more examples of these. So another Wharncliffe example, this is a saber ground Wharncliffe, kind of a cool blade shape. I really like this knife because of the saber grinds, but you can see curve, continuous curve almost, and then straight edge. So that's another example there. And then the Wharncliffe can be a main or a secondary. This is another main blade Wharncliffe on the GEC number 13 office knife, but it can also be a secondary, as you see on that Trapper, as well as on, again, the 82 Dixie stock knife. Then moving on to the sheepfoot, you can see that it is often a secondary blade, like on this Stockman, or on the 35, or on or on this knife, like I say, actually a secondary sheepfoot. Another example of or I'm sorry, but another thing that it can be is a main blade. So this is a sheet foot that is a main blade. Really, really classic traditional Barlow. So it can be both. Let's see, anything else that we need for that? No, so that's the straight edge knives. One more sheet foot, actually, because it's kind of a cool one because it's bigger. This is a secondary sheet foot, but it's pretty big because it's on this Texas camp knife. So that's just a cool one that I wanted to show. So that's most of the blade shapes that I have examples of, but there are a lot more. So for example, this is another pretty traditional at this point because it's been around for over 150 years, is the razor blade shape. So somewhere in the late 19th century, probably, people started making this blade shape so that you could open the knife on, by snagging this hook on your pants. And this is basically a clip point with, without the clip going the whole way. You could easily make this knife into a clip point by just continuing this up to the end of the swedge here, and it would be a clip point. But this is a razor or a one-arm blade shape, which allows it to be opened with one hand by snagging this on the pants. So another traditional blade shape that you don't see quite as often. Let's see, what's another one? Another one is another curved edge, which that last was also, I didn't need to do that, is the hawkbill. So there's different names for this, but basically it's when the edge, rather than being convex, is concave, and the spine is convex. So usually a continuously curved spine. Sometimes the curve is more abrupt, which would then be called a pruner blade shape, which is also a traditional blade shape, but I don't have one. And then this might be considered a talon blade shape. So lots of different variations of this, but it is a traditional. There's a lot of agricultural tools that have this blade shape, and so have been turned into self-defense weapons and things like that. But definitely like the pruner or the karambit. So definitely a traditional blade shape, although I don't have many of them. Let's see what else. Other modified blade shapes. So, and another thing with modern knife companies is that, like I say, I forgot the Tonto. Like I say, they do tend to modify blade shapes. So like this, again, hard to define what the Spyderco, Dora, and Delica blade shapes are, but they've got some aspects of a drop point, they've got some of a clip point, but maybe a drop point. So it's hard to say. Another example of that, again, a Spyderco, is the Ouroboros. Maybe a spear point, maybe a leaf shape because it has more of a continuous curve, but again, hard to tell. So like I say, there's lots of different ones. And one that I almost forgot here is the Tonto blade shape. So this is the Kershaw cathode. You can see a Tonto is when there's a straight edge and then it connects to another straight edge at a different angle. So probably a better example of that is this here. So this is a Cold Steel Micro Recon 1. Very straight edge, they meet at an angle. So this is basically an Americanized Tonto. Japanese or traditional Tontos have less of a abrupt angle, a little bit more of a curve, and it's a different grind that characterizes it, and often have more of a straight spine. You can see this spine curves downward, this spine also curves downward. And then there's another blade shape. This is kind of going towards a Sponto, which is a modified Tonto where there's not a direct angle. But the Tonto is another blade shape that a lot of people are familiar with because it's become considerably more popular recently. So not really a traditional Western blade shape, but it's a traditional Eastern blade shape that has become pretty widely used on modern knives especially. So again, this is the Tonto. But that's most of the blade shapes. Like I said, check out the Knife Thoughts article. There will be, you know, different thoughts on, you know, how they're best used and things like that. So make sure you go to knifethoughts.com. Follow my Instagram at Knife Thoughts and my Twitter at Knife Thoughts. Like I say, if you have any interesting ideas for a Knife Thoughts article, leave them below, and I'll send a sticker out to the idea that I like the best. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel also, and don't forget to go out and do good.